The neighborhood looked perfect from the outside, the kind of place real estate flyers described as quiet, family-friendly, and meticulously maintained. The lawns were trimmed to identical heights, the mailboxes matched in shape and color, and the sidewalks were always clean enough to reflect the sky after a rain. It was the sort of place that promised stability, safety, and predictability. What it did not advertise was the cost of that predictability, or the kind of people who enforced it. The HOA handbook governed everything. The HOA handbook was thicker than some college textbooks, filled with rules that controlled paint shades, fence materials, parking arrangements, holiday decorations, and even how long a garage door could remain open during daylight hours. At first, the rules felt annoying but manageable. I followed them because I believed coexistence required compromise. I believed that if everyone stayed within the lines, the neighborhood would remain peaceful. That belief did not survive long. The first warning notice arrived 3 weeks after I moved in. It cited an unauthorized storage appearance in my garage, based solely on the fact that the door had been open while I unloaded boxes. The second notice came a week later, referencing a trash bin that had been visible from the street for 11 minutes beyond the approved retrieval window. Each notice carried a fine and a warning that repeated violations could lead to corrective action. Corrective action, I would later learn, was a flexible term. The HOA board was led by a woman who had lived in the neighborhood since its construction. She treated the community like a personal kingdom, enforcing rules with a rigid enthusiasm that bordered on obsession. She walked the streets daily with a clipboard, documenting perceived violations. She spoke at board meetings with absolute certainty, and her authority was never questioned by the others, who nodded along as if compliance were a reflex. I avoided her when I could. I paid my fines, corrected minor issues, and tried to remain invisible. My garage, however, became a problem she could not ignore. The garage was detached, set slightly behind my house, and used primarily as a workshop. It was not messy, but it was functional. Tools lined the walls, storage shelves held labeled containers, and a workbench sat in the center. According to HOA standards, it was supposed to look like a showroom, not a place where actual work happened. The handbook stated that garages were for parking vehicles, not non-approved projects. A new notice appeared on my door, this one more aggressive. It accused me of running an unapproved business, despite no evidence of commercial activity. The fine was larger, the tone harsher. It warned that continued non-compliance could result in further action to protect community standards. I submitted a written appeal. I cited the bylaws, provided photographs, and demonstrated that the garage met safety codes. The appeal was denied without explanation. Then the inspections increased. Every few days, another notice appeared. Dust on the garage floor was labeled a fire hazard. Extension cords were called permanent wiring violations. A portable heater, unplugged and stored, was classified as a prohibited appliance. Each citation came with a fine, and each fine came with a deadline. I began documenting everything. I took photos, saved emails, and kept copies of every notice. Years of professional habit made documentation second nature. At the time, it felt like preparation for a dispute. I had no idea it would become evidence of something far worse. The escalation happened quickly. One afternoon, I returned home to find a bright orange notice taped across my garage door. It declared the structure unsafe and ordered immediate closure until further notice. No inspection report accompanied it. No official assessment had been performed. The notice bore only the HOA letterhead and a signature I recognized. I contacted the management company. They referred me back to the board. I requested a formal inspection. The request was unanswered. Days later, a storm rolled through the area. Heavy rain soaked the ground, and lightning split the sky. I was inside when the smell reached me, sharp and unmistakable. Smoke drifted past the windows, thick and dark. By the time I reached the driveway, flames were already visible. The garage was burning. Firefighters arrived quickly, but the structure was already compromised. The roof collapsed inward, sending sparks into the air. The heat was intense, the sound overwhelming. I stood behind the safety line, watching years of tools, equipment, and personal projects disappear into ash. The fire marshal concluded the blaze was caused by an accelerant. The report stated the fire did not originate from faulty wiring or an appliance. It was intentional. The HOA released a statement the following day. It expressed sympathy for the loss while emphasizing the importance of compliance with safety regulations. It implied that improper storage and failure to follow directives may have contributed to the incident. No responsibility was accepted. No investigation was acknowledged. The garage was gone. The fines remained. Insurance covered part of the damage, but not the loss of specialized equipment or irreplaceable personal items. The HOA, meanwhile, sent another notice. It cited the burned structure as an eyesore and demanded removal of debris within 10 days, at my expense. That was when something shifted. The situation was no longer about rules or fines. It was no longer about community standards. It was about power, control, and a deliberate act that had crossed a line no handbook could justify. I reviewed the fire report again. I organized my documentation. I made calls I had never expected to make. Because what the HOA did not know, what no one in that neighborhood knew, was that this was not my first time dealing with abuse of authority, and it was not the first time I had seen someone weaponize rules to destroy what did not belong to them. As the debris cooled and the smell of smoke lingered in the air, I began preparing for something far bigger than a neighborhood dispute. The next chapter of this story would not take place on my driveway or in an HOA meeting room. It would begin in a courtroom.
In the days following the fire, the neighborhood returned to its carefully maintained normal. Lawns were still cut on schedule. Flags were adjusted to approved angles. No one mentioned the blackened space where my garage had stood. Silence in that community was a form of judgment. If something went wrong, it was assumed the person affected must have deserved it. That silence worked in my favor. While the HOA focused on appearances, I focused on records. I requested the full fire investigation file, including photographs, chemical analysis, and responder notes. I filed public records requests for HOA communications, inspection logs, and enforcement histories. I pulled meeting minutes going back 5 years and cross-referenced them with violation notices issued to residents who had ever challenged the board. A pattern emerged almost immediately. Residents who questioned fines, appealed citations, or openly disagreed with the HOA leadership experienced a sharp increase in inspections. Their properties were cited more often, for more obscure reasons, and at higher fine levels. Some sold their homes within a year. Others stopped responding entirely, quietly paying whatever was demanded until they disappeared from the neighborhood. The board president's name appeared everywhere. Emails showed her directing management to keep an eye on certain properties. Notes from meetings referenced problem homeowners without naming them, followed by discussions of enforcement strategies. In one message, she explicitly stated that compliance was easier when pressure is applied consistently. Pressure, it seemed, was her specialty. I also discovered something else. The HOA had recently changed its insurance policy, reducing coverage for detached structures deemed non-essential. That classification had been applied to my garage shortly before the fire, based solely on the notice declaring it unsafe. No city inspector had signed off on that determination. The HOA had acted unilaterally, without authority. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not negligence, it was calculated. The fire marshal's report was particularly damning. Traces of accelerant were found near the rear support beam, far from any electrical source. Footprints had been partially preserved in the wet ground, leading from the alley behind the property to the garage door. The report concluded that the fire was intentionally set by an unknown party. Unknown did not mean untraceable. I requested security footage from nearby properties. Most neighbors declined, citing privacy concerns. A few claimed their cameras had malfunctioned that night. One homeowner, however, provided footage from a rear-facing camera that overlooked the alley. The video was grainy, but it showed a figure approaching my garage shortly before the fire started. The figure moved with familiarity, unhurried and confident, wearing clothing consistent with what the board president often wore during her neighborhood patrols. It was not definitive proof, but it was enough to raise questions. I forwarded everything to my attorney. He was methodical, calm, and unimpressed by the HOA's reputation. He reviewed the documents, the footage, the fire report, and the pattern of enforcement. He did not promise outcomes. He did not speculate. He simply said that what I had described was not a civil dispute anymore. It was criminal. The complaint was filed quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no public accusation. The HOA continued issuing notices, including one that fined me for failing to rebuild the garage within a prescribed timeline. I ignored it. The board scheduled a hearing to address my non-compliance. I did not attend. Instead, subpoenas went out. The management company was compelled to turn over internal communications. Board members were required to provide statements. Financial records were examined, revealing that fines collected from targeted homeowners were used to fund legal defenses and private security contracts, none of which had been disclosed to residents. The board president responded with outrage. She sent letters accusing me of harassment, defamation, and intentional disruption of community harmony. She warned that my actions would result in further penalties. She copied every homeowner on the street, framing herself as a victim of a disgruntled resident unwilling to follow rules. The neighborhood watched. Some residents avoided me entirely. Others watched from behind curtains, curious but silent. A few began to ask questions of their own, noticing inconsistencies they had previously ignored. The board president doubled down, holding emergency meetings and issuing stern reminders about unity and obedience. The pressure campaign intensified. Then the police called. They wanted a formal statement. The accelerant used in the fire had been traced to a specific brand, sold locally in limited quantities. Purchase records showed a transaction made with a personal credit card, not a business account. The card belonged to someone who had no legitimate reason to possess that product. Someone with access to the alley, knowledge of the garage layout, and a motive rooted in control. The investigation progressed faster than anyone expected. The HOA attempted to distance itself. The board claimed ignorance, suggesting that any wrongdoing was the act of an individual acting alone. They suspended the president temporarily, citing the need for an impartial review. The suspension came with full pay and a statement praising her years of service. It was too late. Charges were filed. Arson, abuse of authority, fraud. The news spread quickly. Local media picked up the story, framing it as a shocking example of HOA overreach gone criminal. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood entrance. Cameras captured residents entering and leaving, their expressions tense and guarded. The board president disappeared from public view. I received notice of the court date in the mail. The case had been assigned to a judge with a reputation for fairness and an intolerance for power games. The prosecution prepared its evidence. The defense attempted delays. And then, buried in the court docket, I saw something that made me stop. The judge's name. My name. The realization settled slowly, heavy and unavoidable. Years ago, I had recused myself from cases involving personal interest. This one, however, had been assigned before the connection was flagged. Procedures were followed, ethics were reviewed, a decision was made. I would not preside over the case. I would, however, be present. Because before I became a homeowner in that neighborhood, before I lost a garage to fire and control, I had been something else entirely. Someone trained to see through manipulation, to recognize abuse of power, and to ensure accountability when rules were twisted into weapons. The courtroom would be where the truth finally surfaced, and when the defendant heard her name called, she would realize just how badly she had misjudged the person she tried to silence.
The courthouse carried a weight that no HOA meeting ever could. Its halls were quiet but purposeful, built to remind everyone who entered that authority here was not self-appointed. It was earned, regulated, and bound by law. The contrast between this space and the neighborhood clubhouse, where power had been wielded like a personal weapon, could not have been sharper. The case drew attention before proceedings even began. Reporters lined the steps outside, eager to capture reactions, to frame the narrative as a dramatic fall from grace. Inside, the atmosphere was restrained but electric. This was not just an arson case. It was a story about what happens when someone mistakes control for entitlement. I sat in the gallery, not on the bench. That alone unsettled the defense. They had prepared for a different kind of battle, one where intimidation and procedural games could buy time or wear down opposition. Instead, they faced a system that had already seen through those tactics. The defendant entered without the confidence she once displayed during neighborhood patrols. The rigid posture, the practiced expressions of authority were gone. In their place was a controlled tension, the kind that comes from realizing the rules no longer bend to your will. The charges were read. The words echoed through the courtroom, stripped of euphemisms. Arson, fraud, abuse of authority. Each count represented a deliberate choice, a step taken beyond enforcement and into criminality. The prosecution outlined the timeline methodically, connecting notices, inspections, financial decisions, and the night of the fire into a single, unbroken chain. The defense attempted to fracture that chain. They argued obsession, not intent, overzealous enforcement, not malice. They suggested a rogue act born of frustration, disconnected from the HOA as an institution. They emphasized her years of service, her commitment to maintaining property values, her belief that she was acting in the community's best interest. It was a familiar narrative, authority cloaked in good intentions. Evidence dismantled it piece by piece. The accelerant purchase was introduced, matched to receipts and timestamps. The security footage, though imperfect, was contextualized with witness testimony. Neighbors described her routine patrols, her access to restricted areas, her habit of confronting homeowners late in the evening. Emails revealed premeditation, language that framed enforcement as punishment rather than compliance. Then came the financial records. Fines collected from targeted residents had been diverted into accounts used to fund private investigations and legal consultations, all approved without board oversight. The prosecution demonstrated how those funds supported actions designed to intimidate, not regulate. The garage, classified as unsafe without inspection, became the linchpin of the scheme, its destruction serving both as retaliation and a warning. Throughout it all, the defendant watched, expression tight, hands clasped too firmly. The moment came when the court addressed a procedural matter that forced her to look directly at me. The prosecutor referenced my documentation, my records, my professional background. The judge acknowledged my presence as a party of interest, not as an arbiter, but as someone whose experience lent clarity to the evidence presented. Recognition flickered. It was subtle but unmistakable. The realization that the person she had targeted, fined, and ultimately tried to intimidate into submission was not just another homeowner, that the system she had abused was now examining her actions through the eyes of someone who understood exactly how power was meant to be exercised. Her composure cracked. The trial continued over several days. Each session peeled back another layer of justification, revealing the core truth beneath. This was not about community standards. It was about control, about the belief that authority granted by proximity and tenure was absolute, and that resistance was a personal affront to be eliminated.
Witnesses from the neighborhood testified. Some spoke reluctantly, others with visible relief. They described fines that escalated without cause, threats of liens, and the quiet fear of becoming the next target. Their stories, once isolated, formed a chorus. The defense's strategy shifted. They sought sympathy, portraying the defendant as overwhelmed by responsibility, unsupported by the board, pushed beyond reason. They hinted at stress, at mental health struggles, at a momentary lapse of judgment. The prosecution did not dispute stress. They disputed inevitability. Choice was the theme that carried through closing arguments. The choice to escalate, the choice to retaliate, the choice to light a match. As deliberations began, the courtroom emptied into the waiting areas. Conversations were hushed, movements deliberate. The defendant sat alone, separated now from the board members who had once deferred to her. The institution that empowered her had already begun rewriting its narrative, distancing itself from the consequences. When the jury returned, the room stilled. The verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. The sound that followed was not applause or outrage, but a collective exhale. Accountability, when it arrives, is often quiet. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date. The defendant was remanded into custody, her authority fully stripped, her control reduced to compliance with the very system she had once manipulated. As she was led away, her gaze found mine again. This time there was no confusion, no miscalculation, only the weight of understanding. The story, however, was not over, because the fallout would extend beyond one person. The HOA, the board, the neighborhood itself would have to confront the culture that allowed this to happen. Policies would be questioned, power structures examined, trust rebuilt if possible. The next chapter would not focus on punishment, but on reckoning, on what happens after the gavel falls, when a community is forced to look at itself without the comfort of denial, and on how justice, once set in motion, reshapes everything in its path.
The verdict marked an ending, but it also triggered a chain reaction that no one in the neighborhood could stop. Authority, once exposed as illegitimate, does not simply disappear. It fractures, leaving behind confusion, fear, and an urgent need to assign blame. The Homeowners Association, built on the illusion of order and control, began to unravel almost immediately. Within hours of the guilty verdict, the HOA's website went offline. Emergency emails were sent to residents, assuring them that operations would continue as normal. The tone was calm, almost rehearsed, but the timing betrayed panic. The board members, who had once hidden behind procedure and deference, now scrambled to protect themselves. Meetings were canceled, then rescheduled, then canceled again. Residents started talking, not in hushed tones behind closed doors, but openly, on sidewalks and driveways, in online forums and group chats that had previously been used to complain about paint colors and parking violations. Stories poured out, many of them echoing the same pattern: selective enforcement, unexplained fines, threats of legal action for minor infractions, and the quiet understanding that resistance only made things worse. The culture of fear had been normalized for so long that many had mistaken it for order. The management company issued a statement distancing itself from the former board president. They claimed they had acted only on instructions provided by the board, following established protocols. Internal emails, now circulating among residents, told a different story. They showed compliance motivated by profit, a willingness to overlook irregularities as long as fines were paid and complaints were contained. Law firms took notice. Class action discussions began almost immediately. Residents compared records, discovering discrepancies in enforcement and unexplained financial charges. Some realized they had paid thousands in fines that had no legal basis. Others learned that liens had been threatened or placed improperly, based on violations that did not exist. The illusion of legitimacy collapsed under the weight of shared experience. City officials launched their own review.
They examined the HOA's authority, its compliance with municipal regulations, and its use of enforcement powers. The detached garage classifications, the insurance changes, and the lack of inspections raised red flags. The HOA had acted beyond its scope, blurring the line between governance and vigilantism. As the investigation widened, board members resigned one by one. Some did so quietly, citing personal reasons. Others issued statements filled with carefully worded regret, acknowledging mistakes without accepting responsibility. A few attempted to defend their actions, insisting they had trusted the president's judgment and never imagined it could lead to criminal behavior. Trust, however, was no longer a valid defense. The neighborhood itself changed. The uniformity that once defined it began to crack. Lawns grew at different rates. Decorations appeared outside approved windows. Garage doors stayed open a little longer. These small acts of defiance were not acts of rebellion, but of relief. Residents tested the boundaries, discovering that the sky did not fall when rules were bent. For the first time in years, people felt ownership of their homes. I remained mostly in the background, watching the transformation unfold. My role in the case was well known, but I did not seek attention. The garage lot remained empty, cleared of debris, but not rebuilt. It stood as a quiet reminder of what unchecked authority could do. Letters arrived daily. Some were apologies, awkward and overdue. Others were requests for guidance, from residents unsure how to navigate a system they no longer trusted. A few were angry, accusing me of destabilizing the community, of bringing scrutiny and chaos where order once existed. Order, I knew, is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of fairness. The sentencing hearing came and went. The former board president received a prison term commensurate with her crimes. The judge's words were measured, but firm, emphasizing that abuse of authority erodes trust not just in institutions, but in the rule of law itself. Her fall from power was complete, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale. But the story did not end with her imprisonment. The HOA faced lawsuits, regulatory penalties, and the very real possibility of dissolution. Insurance providers reevaluated coverage. Banks questioned the association's financial stability. Property values fluctuated, driven by uncertainty rather than enforcement. A special election was called to form a new board. Attendance was unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. Residents who had never participated showed up, armed with questions and documents. They demanded transparency, limits on enforcement, and mechanisms for accountability. They wanted clear processes, independent oversight, and an end to punitive practices. They wanted their neighborhood back. The meeting stretched late into the evening, not because of arguments, but because of engagement. People spoke about what they wanted the community to be, rather than what they feared it might become. The shift was subtle, but profound. As new leadership took shape, policies were suspended pending review. Fines were frozen. Appeals were reopened. For some residents, restitution became a possibility. For others, closure was enough. I watched as the system corrected itself, not perfectly, but deliberately. The empty garage lot remained unchanged as the seasons shifted. Grass began to grow along the edges, softening the scar left by fire. I did not rush to rebuild. There was no urgency now, no pressure to conform or comply. The space had become symbolic, a reminder of both loss and resilience. The next chapter would not be about destruction or collapse. It would be about resolution, about the final reckoning between past abuse and future accountability, and the unexpected moment when the person who once wielded power would face the full weight of what she had done. Because there was still one more encounter to come.
Time has a way of settling chaos into clarity. In the months after the HOA's collapse, the neighborhood slowly found its footing again. The tension that once hung in the air like a permanent storm cloud began to lift, replaced by something unfamiliar but welcome, normalcy that did not feel enforced. The new HOA board operated differently from the beginning. Meetings were recorded, decisions were documented, enforcement actions required multiple approvals and independent verification. The handbook, once treated as a weapon, was rewritten in plain language. Rules that existed solely to exert control were removed entirely. People noticed. Neighbors waved again. Conversations lingered. The community began to resemble what it had pretended to be all along. I finally began the process of rebuilding the garage. Not the same structure, not the same layout, but something better. Permits were obtained through the city, inspections conducted properly, everything transparent and documented. No orange notices appeared, no fines followed. The absence of interference was almost jarring. Closure, however, does not always come from rebuilding what was lost. Sometimes it comes from facing what caused the loss in the first place. The former board president filed an appeal. It was a long shot, but not unexpected. People who believe rules exist to serve them rarely accept consequences without one last attempt to regain control. The appeal was granted a hearing, limited in scope, focused on procedural challenges rather than facts. And that was how I found myself back in a courtroom, once again sitting where I was meant to observe rather than preside. The room was smaller this time, quieter. No cameras, no reporters, just legal professionals, records, and the weight of finality. The defendant looked different, not just older, but diminished. The certainty that once defined her was gone, replaced by something fragile and defensive. When the clerk called the case, her name echoed through the room. Then came the moment she had not anticipated. The panel included a judge she recognized, not from the bench, but from memory, from documents, from the fire, from the realization that had first crossed her face during the original trial. Me. The rules of ethics were followed to the letter. I did not preside, I did not speak. My role was procedural, limited, but unavoidable. My name appeared on the record as part of the appellate review process, not as a decision-maker, but as a reference point for prior proceedings in evidentiary handling. It was enough. The moment she understood was visible. The stillness, the sharp inhale, the collapse of whatever narrative she had been clinging to. The person she had tried to intimidate, to punish, to erase, had not only survived, but had become an immutable part of the legal framework closing in around her. The appeal did not last long. Procedural errors were dismissed, evidence was upheld, the original verdict stood, the sentence remained unchanged. There were no loopholes left, no rules to twist, no authority to hide behind. When the decision was finalized, there was no dramatic reaction, no outburst, just resignation. Control, once lost, rarely returns. I left the courthouse without fanfare, without satisfaction, without bitterness. Justice, when done properly, does not require celebration. It requires completion. Back in the neighborhood, the garage stood finished. Clean lines, functional space, no pretense. It was a place meant to be used, not inspected into submission. I spent time there again, working without fear of a clipboard or a fine. The HOA, now quieter and more transparent, continued its slow evolution. Mistakes were still made, but they were addressed openly. Authority became a responsibility rather than a weapon. The story spread online, as stories like this often do. People saw it as drama, as entertainment, as another example of an HOA gone wrong. But for those who lived it, it was something else entirely. It was a lesson. Power without accountability is fragile. Control built on fear is temporary. And rules, when enforced without fairness, eventually turn on those who abuse them. The garage fire had taken something tangible from me. The aftermath had revealed something far more important. In the end,
The name the judge called was not the one that mattered most. It was the realization that authority, when challenged by truth, always freezes. And this time, it stayed that way.